What's up, nerds? Is Ukraine losing the war to Russia? I've seen this said basically multiple times in my comment section, and it seems to mostly be coming from pro-Russian viewers. And so I kind of want to take a moment to take a look at the war as it stands right now and really assess, is Russia winning this thing right now? And why is that? Or, are they not winning this thing? And why would that be? So I think now is about as good a time as ever to assess how true that statement might be. We're going to look over where the fight is today. More specifically, we're going to look at the supply of Western equipment versus Russian production. We're going to look at manpower. We're going to look at where the battlefield actually stands and where things are moving. And we're also going to look at political will. And all of this is, of course, as of when I'm recording this, which is April 18th, 2024. So first and foremost, Ukraine is entirely reliant on Western aid to continue fighting. I don't think that that's a shock to anybody here. I think we're all kind of familiar with them's the terms pretty much. They are unable to domestically produce the artillery or the air defense munitions in the quantity that they need, nor are they really able to produce the systems that launch those, that launch that ammunition necessarily in the way that they need. One of the biggest donors of equipment to the Ukrainian military had been Russia, at the start of the war, just in captured equipment. But at this point, what they really need is ammunition. It's not necessarily the systems, but it's the ability to fire off those rounds at all, which is a huge thing that we're going to talk about. But truthfully, the West here as a whole is struggling with producing ammunition. It'll take about a year or two collectively for both the European and the United States, defense industrial bases to spool up, get the ammunition created in the quantity that's needed. But Russia is already producing the quantity that they need. And not only are they producing shells in the quantity that they need, they're getting help from North Korea and Iran. North Korea providing artillery shells and Iran recently providing ballistic missiles. Without Western aid, some have suggested that I've seen that the Ukraine will only have a matter of months before disaster strikes. And even in the past couple years, whenever Western aid was, pretty routinely flowing into Ukraine, Ukraine was still being outgunned by Russian artillery. So even once, the defense industrial bases spool up and Ukraine's getting the artillery that they need, or the shells that they need, they're probably not going to start matching or outgunning Russian artillery. We just need to, kind of set those expectations. But what they really need is just to impose as much cost on advancing Russian infantry as possible. And we'll talk about why that's important here in a moment. But while artillery is important for ground assaults, air defense is becoming way more strategically important. The Russian use of Fab glide bombs offers Russia and the Russian Air Force precision at a distance, which is something that we expected to see at the start of the war, but we didn't. And part of that was not only because Russia had failed to innovate with cheap Fab glide kits that we've seen now, but they also were being shot down by air defense and the Ukrainian Air Force. And now with air defense munitions reaching critically low levels, the Russian Air Force is able to fly pretty much with impunity in some areas and drop those glide bombs and cause significant losses not only to the civilian population but to the military. And so this is going to be an extremely dangerous situation if this continues at this trend. The impacts to even more hardened defensive positions will be a real problem for Ukraine. European aid is still coming through, though. We've already talked about a NATO aid package that is still being worked on. The Czech initiative should start delivering hundreds of thousands of artillery shells, in the next month or two. However, nobody can really bring the impact in terms of aid that the United States can. With the Ukrainian aid supplemental package still stuck in Congress and has been stuck in Congress for over a month, but it looks like this may be passed soon. We'll get to that in just a moment. But in terms of production and supply, I'd argue, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to prove wrong that Russia is in the lead right now. It will require dramatic changes within the collective West to fix this. Not only in the United States, but within, European countries and within NATO. Passing the Ukraine aid supplemental in Congress will be a great start to, remediating this challenge. And that's also with the completion of the Czech initiative. The Czech initiative is, should have produced at least over 800,000 artillery shells, which is nothing to sniff at, but it might have even produced some more shells as well. And that the list of countries that's supporting the Czech initiative is pretty interesting. It includes both India and Pakistan and Serbia, which, not only, putting aside the fact that India and Pakistan are working together on a military issue, that's something that's awesome. But Serbia was believed to be, pretty pro-Russia. Now they're involved with this. I think that's pretty that's a pretty interesting detail there. But the real issue is the defense industrial base. You can deliver artillery rounds that have already been produced and that were in massive stockpiles across the world. However, what you really need is a defense industrial base to spool itself up and produce these shells in quantity, but over a sustained amount of time. Fixing the defense industrial base to get back into mass production will be a huge help for Ukraine and really also just in general for NATO. But this is atrophied since the end of the Cold War. And we know the last time that the U.S. really needed massive quantities of military equipment to fight and win a war. Contractors love multi-year contracts, and I think that all you really need to do here, if you're the United States, is sign a multi-year artillery shell production contract with a contractor on behalf of Ukraine, and this will be done in the form of a loan. And, loans can always be forgiven, but I think everybody's happy. Ukraine gets aid, the U.S. gets it in the form of a loan, so at least on paper, we'll get paid back later. The contractor gets a multi-year contract, and the whole defense industrial base, this impacts that overall picture of our ability to produce equipment and ammunition. But until that happens, Russia has the advantage in terms of supply. Now, the next thing is manpower, and we've already talked about this, so we're not going to go in tremendous amount of detail here, but Russia clearly has the advantage just in terms of population. They're able to access way more able-bodied recruits and mobilize more than Ukraine can. They've been able to do that with rolling mobilizations and with recruitment of foreign volunteers. Ukraine has not yet passed another mobilization bill. They have decreased the mobilization age. I know we've already talked about in that other video how that really only unlocks about 50,000 eligible people to be brought into uniform, but that's nowhere near what's needed. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian troops have been fighting since the war began. Many of those have been killed or wounded, and the rest are losing combat effectiveness. And so this is a politically sensitive issue. That's why this is kind of not happening very quickly. And we've talked more in detail about that in that other video. So I'm going to link you to that at the end of this video. But, bottom line here, Russia has a clear advantage here, and they have since the beginning. And I don't think that that's a shock to anybody. Now, next is where the battle line is today. And who has the advantage? And I think that this is really kind of harder to say. Neither side is really capable of a breakthrough right now. Russia has made gains in recent months, but you really have to zoom into the map to see them. These are small towns, tree lines, fields, creeks, that kind of thing. Not significant, blitzes through massive amounts of territory. Even just from Bakhmut, in the past several months since Bakhmut fell, they've really only advanced about 8 to 9 kilometers westward. So that's not a significant, and Bakhmut falling was a pretty politically significant event, but at the same time, it didn't cause a breakthrough. The whole Russian thesis with Bakhmut was that, they take Bakhmut, it'll punch a hole in Ukrainian defenses and it'll be a blitz to Kiev. That just did not happen. And, I don't know if that was necessarily the same thing that they were looking at with Avdiivka. They've advanced a little bit further around Avdiivka. However, at the same time, it's not that significant blitz, northward towards Kiev that I think people really anticipate. But most importantly, each of these advances are coming at a high cost. Both Bakhmut and Avdiivka collectively cost Russia, well over 100,000 Russian servicemen killed or wounded. Russia still maintains the initiative on the battlefield, and that is worth something politically. And they're preparing for a fight over Chasiv Yar. And again, that is another thing that I've spoken about in way more detail, kind of analyzing that battle as it comes up here. And I'm going to link you to that video at the end of this as well. Now, this is likely going to be another long, bloody fight, more dependent on Ukrainian supply than Russian willpower and capability. Russia has a pretty strong offensive capability right now, and it's continuing to grow as they continue to mobilize and build their strength for an offensive. But, Russian advances will likely move at the speed of infantry movement and not necessarily the speed of equipment due to not only equipment losses, but just their general need to reduce equipment losses. It's not that Russia has no equipment. It's not like they've run out or they're about to run out of tanks and IFVs. It's that they've lost so many that if this trend continues over the course of another year or two, then Russia will have some serious problems with equipment. So they have to adjust kind of their usage of this equipment and how often they're using it in assaults or they're going to have themselves a real pickle. Finally, let's talk about political willpower. Now, I would argue at the beginning of the war that Ukraine had the advantage here. It had Western backing. It was fighting a defensive war of national independence and survival. And Russia, on the other hand, was fighting a war of conquest that was entirely voluntary on their end. Most Russian troops didn't even know that they were fighting in Ukraine until they landed in Ukraine. Since then, the political will for Ukraine has taken some significant hits. Of course, delays in Western aid has been a significant deal. It's left Ukrainians feeling abandoned. The ghost of Afghanistan looms large over Ukraine, and there's that concern that Ukraine could be the next Afghanistan where, the U.S. stops providing aid and the whole thing just falls apart. I don't necessarily think that that's going to happen, but we'll talk about that. There's concern just generally more broadly that without Western aid, they're heading towards a defeat. The Russian advances in the fall of Avdiivka, of course, have been hard for Ukrainians. And you can check, and it's really been a bit of a boon politically for Russians. And as an example, check my comments section. I have a lot of pro-Russian people, watching my videos and commenting. They don't really like what I have to say, but they keep watching, so whatever. But, a lot of those comments and a lot of those viewers kind of paint these pictures that, Ukraine is screwed, the West has failed, and it is inevitable that Russia will win this war. And it sounds like they believe that they're going to win. And I don't know about you, but it sounds like they have it sounds like there is political willpower to me. It doesn't sound like, Russia is struggling here despite their losses. It sounds like they're pretty convinced that if they keep this up, then things will work out. Now, within the West, war fatigue is starting to sit in. There are concerns, of course, politically within the U.S. government that with election season coming up, the cost of the war, the impact of the economy, the impact to the economy that this war is having, and those costs are not that significant. But it's a politically sensitive time, so they don't want gas to shoot up in price. I think Iran's probably a bigger deal for the gas prices than the war in Ukraine is. But at the same time, it's not going to help. And so that's kind of where we've seen some White House officials telling Ukraine, please don't attack their oil infrastructure, even though it shouldn't make a difference to us because we're sanctioning that infrastructure and we're not taking their oil. So then if it gets destroyed, what difference does it make? Whatever. We don't need to get into that. We've already talked about that as well, actually. But it's a politically sensitive time, especially here in the United States. And the Ukrainian aid bill being held up in Congress kind of exemplifies this point. I'd argue that today, Russia's starting to get the advantage in political will, but I think that is something that can change very quickly. It changes with the wind. Political will, it's kind of a hard thing to kind of hammer down, especially because it can change so quickly. So overall, who's winning? I'd say, right now Russia's moving in the right direction for victory and Ukraine is in a very difficult position. They're in for a very difficult 2024. I would say, however, that it is hard to say that Russia is winning. Again, for Russia to win this war, they haven't dropped their kind of total objectives in Ukraine. So they have to get all the way to Kiev. They have to topple the Ukrainian government. That's their objective. I do not think that they have the capability or the capacity to break through Ukrainian lines and go topple, the Ukrainian government. I think that there are even some easy fixes on the Ukraine side that can really help Ukraine kind of change this outlook. First and foremost, of course, is passing the Ukraine aid bill in U.S. Congress. Getting much needed ammunition in the hands of the Ukrainian warfighter would be a huge, huge deal for this war. It would dispel the notion in Ukraine that they are being abandoned. And it's not just that, they need one Ukraine aid bill. They're going to need this one Ukraine aid bill just to kind of make up for the distance since the last time we've, given them any kind of aid. And then we're going to need to probably pass something again just to make sure that they have something to hold them off into the future, unless we can get this aid bill large enough that it'll sustain them for several months. That notion has to be dispelled in Ukraine that they're being abandoned. I think that kind of alters that political will picture. And longer term aid, again, like I said, is better. Now, whether this aid is free of charge or within the form of a loan, it all works for Ukraine. They need something. Whatever it takes to put Russian jets back on the ground, prevent them from using precision munitions, whatever it takes to punish Russian infantry during their assaults, and cause as much, loss to the Russian army as possible during these assaults. That's what Ukraine really needs right now, especially with, the Battle of Chasiv Yar looming and a looming Russian offensive coming up for the summer. Now, next, of course, as I mentioned before, especially in that other video on mobilization, Ukraine really needs to get more people in uniform. And I've already talked about that in that video. It's way more detailed, way more nuanced. It's a bigger issue than just that. So I would encourage you to go check that out if you want to learn more about how impactful that can be in this war, but at the same time, how hard that it is to do. Now, of course, this final point kind of sounds pretty obvious, but I'm just going to say it. Ukraine just needs to stop the Russian advance. And I think that comes with a passing of the Ukraine aid supplemental and, kind of releasing that logjam of ammunition. Once Ukraine has ammunition, and I think once they have, replenished forces on the front, I think that this just kind of comes with time. I think that they do halt Russian advances. Chasiv Yar will be an opportunity, at the very least, to heavily attrit the Russian army. They're going to have to force Russia to eat up, basically an entire wave of mobilization to punch through each town. We looked at the Battle of Bakhmut. We've seen the Battle of Avdiivka. These were incredibly costly for the Russian military, and it took them, a very long time for them to complete these battles. But once they were completed, they had some fairly significant political impacts. But militarily, they didn't cause any kind of a breakthrough. Defensively, Ukrainian lines have held. So with Ukraine building more sturdy defensive lines, further north of Avdiivka, further west of Chasiv Yar, it'll be important for Ukraine to make these basically massive kill zones where they prevent the Russian army from continuing much further than Chasiv Yar. Make it, if Russia's going to win in Chasiv Yar, Ukraine has to make it a Pyrrhic victory. Impose as much cost for Russia to take Chasiv Yar, so much so that they just don't have the capability to push much further. And like we've talked about in that video on Chasiv Yar, those next towns that they're going to have to fight in are going to be much, much harder for them than Chasiv Yar was. So with all that, I want to hear what you have to say on this. Of course, I would imagine some of you guys will probably not agree with what I have to say in this video. Again, take my analysis for what it is. It's just what I see. I want to hear your thoughts on that. Like this video if you found it helpful or informative, and subscribe for more analysis not only on this war, but on other conflicts as they pop up.